right, then moving on, we are now in part 6 on corruptions of Christianity, Jehovah's Witnesses. If you'd like to follow along, you can go to creationliberty.com, type in the word witness, W-I-T-N-E-S-S, and that will take you to the article. Again, it's called Corruptions of Christianity, Jehovah's Witnesses. And the part you want to click on is about a false prophet is the devil's prophet. Or if you're listening by YouTube, there's a link in the description. You should be able to click that, and that'll take you roughly to where we are. You probably have to scroll down because we ended last week. We were starting to talk about all these different printed magazines, how the Millerite Adventists, Russellite cults, they started getting really addicted to these magazines, and they all have their own magazines that are come out, and they all have lots of conferences. They got to have conferences and magazines. That's their big thing. So last week we were talking about the 1844 prophecies, and we're going to get into a bunch of the different prophecies that have happened over the course of the past 150 years, but we got done talking about the 1844 one. We're moving on to the one that was in 1874 and 1876. And then last week I finished mentioning that Charles Russell didn't meet Nelson Barber until 1867, which was a couple of years after the prophecy of 1874 was supposed to be fulfilled. But then he added in a tarrying time, and then another thing he called a harvest time. So then he claimed that the bride of Christ wouldn't be translated into heaven, or in short, they believed the Christians wouldn't go to heaven until 1878. But he did believe, now remember, he believed that Christ did return in 1874. He believed that prophecy was true, but we're just waiting for everything for us to be able to see everything. But Jesus was here, but he was invisible. And again, that's incognito Jesus we talked about. And so Barber also taught that the Gentile times would be over in 1914. And Russell jumped on board. He sold his retail clothing chain for a very large sum of money and invested into that magazine. And we covered that very early on in this course of teaching. So that's the general context I want to make sure we understand to get back to. So Nelson Barber, who is now financially backed by Charles Russell, published the following in 1878. Now this prediction that he made, it says, quote, "The end of this world," which he has in all capital letters, "the end of this world, that is, the end of the gospel and the beginning of the millennial age, is nearer than most men suppose." Now what does he mean by the millennial age? He's talking about the 1,000-year reign of Christ that's predicted in Revelation. Okay? He continues and says, "Indeed, we have already entered the transition period." What he means, he calls that the harvest time. He says that's going to be 3.5 years. That's what he's talking about there. He says, "Indeed, we have already entered the transition period, which is to be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation," end quote. So you see, these predictions were being clearly made back then. But as you can probably guess, 1878 came and went, and nothing happened. So after 1878, Barber and Russell, they split apart. They had some disagreements. Russell came up with a new date, and he disagreed with Nelson Barber on a couple of things, and so they went their separate ways. Russell believed that the bride of Christ would be translated in 1881, not 1878. Well, as you can guess, 1881 came and went, and nothing happened. So Russell decided to change his initial prophecy and claimed that 1881 was, quote, and this is according to studies in the scriptures. He said, quote, "The general call to this joint heirship with our Redeemer as members of the new creation of God," end quote. I'm having a hard time understanding that one. Because first of all, I'll try to summarize this the best I can, because I know this is a little confusing. They said Jesus is coming back in 1874. Nobody saw him. Okay, he's here invisibly. He's incognito Jesus. But now we have a tarrying time before he appears. Okay, the tarrying time's passed, but now we have a harvest time And this is being done invisibly, one step at a time. Angels are coming and plucking people up, and it's going to happen over about 3.5 years. Okay, 3.5 years have passed, and, well, nothing's happened. Okay, guys, it's another 3.5 years. Sorry about that. It's actually another 3.5 years to complete the thing, because it's going to be a total of 7 years. And so, oh wait, the 7 years passed. Well, actually what that was the general call to a joint heirship with our Redeemer as members of the new creation of God. That's what happened there. And that mysterious call, according to Charles Russell, ceased in 1881. I'll just stick with the Bible. Thank you. I don't really need any of this garbage. It's too confusing, but people believe it. And surprisingly, they had quite a number of cult followers who believed this stuff. However, Russell still stuck to Barber's original story that incognito Jesus was already on the earth but just couldn't be seen, and he reiterated that in his writings. Now, the following quotes I'm going to give you are taken from, again, Studies in the Scriptures, which was, by the way, it was originally called The Plan of the Ages and The Divine Plan of the Ages. That's what originally the book was called, which Russell wrote this down in 1886. He said, quote, "If, then, the 7,000th year period of the Earth's history be an epoch," now an epoch means a time period, okay, that's all that word means. "If that be an epoch, specially noted as the period of Christ's reign, we shall, by showing that it began in 1873, be proving that we are already in it," end quote. So, in case you didn't understand that, because it was a little strangely worded, Russell claimed that we have been in the millennial 1,000-year reign of Christ since 1873. Now, in another volume, he says that Christ, which is that incognito Jesus, has been present since 1874, and that he was formerly, right? There's like the grand ceremony. He was officially given kingship over the world in 1878. Because, I mean, this brings up so many questions, I know. I know it brings up tons of questions. Don't ask me, because I don't have an answer. I cannot give you answers from a cultic mentality, okay, of why exactly did God decide to wait 4 years, put incognito Jesus down on earth, keep him invisible so nobody knows he's there, and then give him kingship invisibly in 1878? I mean, just a general reading of the book of Revelation will show this is a bunch of nonsense. Anyway, continuing, they believe that Christ was in the process of gathering the Christians. It's like a long, drawn-out process. Even though the Bible doesn't say that anywhere, this is what they are believing. So again, from Studies in the Scriptures, it says, quote, "But now we are in the end of this gospel age." Okay, so we are talking about a little bit about that even in our first half of this gospel age. The gospel age will be the dispensation of the Christians, okay? So that would be some people call it the church age. I don't particularly like that phrase because what preachers do is they imply that it's a church building age. And so I literally have met preachers like that. I'm not kidding. They think that home churches are of the devil. I'm not making that up. I have met them, okay? But anyway, it's the gospel age, meaning that this is the dispensation, the Bible calls it, okay, of the gospel going out into the world. But Russell is saying, but now we are in the end of this gospel age. So you see, this is not unclear in any way. He predicted this is the end of the world and the ushering in of Christ. That's what he claimed. And by the way, we're like 150 years past that point. I just want to keep reminding everybody of that. And the kingdom is being established or set up. That was his claim. Our Lord, the appointed king, is now present since October 1874 AD, according to the testimony of the prophets to those who have ears to hear it. And the formal inauguration of his kingly office dates from April 1878 AD. And the first work of the kingdom, as shown by our Lord, in his parables and prophecy, the gathering of his elect, is now in progress." End quote. Now, I'd also like to point out that if any of this were true, then the Jehovah's Witnesses incognito Jesus must be asleep on the job. Because soon after this point, World War I broke out, then later World War II. And there's a whole lot of suffering that's going on right now. So, I mean, Jehovah's Witnesses today still believe that Jesus is on earth invisibly today. I don't even know if all of them are aware that this is what they believe. I'm not sure about that because I have not met all Jehovah's Witnesses. But generally, this is what they still teach to this day. But our world is getting worse all the time. So the Jehovah's Witnesses incognito Jesus either is stupid or he doesn't care. I don't know which one it is. But this is all despite the fact that Russell's prophecy stated that all government institutions were supposed to be shut down before 1915. Yes, he did say this. Okay, let's go back to studies in the scriptures again. He said, quote, "True, it is expecting great things to claim, as we do, that within the coming 26 years," now what he meant by that was the end of 1914, okay? So you do the math and you calculate backwards. He's talking about by the end of 1914. He said, "All present governments will be overthrown and dissolved." I repeat, he said all governments will be overthrown and dissolved. Did that happen? No. Nothing even close to that has happened. Pretty much every government on the earth that existed back then is still in existence today. He continues and says, "But we are living in a special and peculiar time, the day of Jehovah, in which matters accumulate quickly. And it is written, a short work will the Lord make upon the earth." End quote. Well, yeah, a short work he'll make when the time actually comes, when you actually see the signs coming. Okay, because even right now, what we've got to have, because if you look at the prophecies of Scripture, you see that the horns that were supposed to come, Daniel prophesied of that, and it goes on through Matthew, it goes on through Revelation. You see that these horns that are formed, there's 10 of them, and they represent 10 kings. Then 3 of them get knocked out, and 1 comes in, that 8th horn. That horn is supposed to be the son of perdition. So you've got to have the entire world, 280 countries under 10 kings. That's going to happen. And then 3 of those kings will have to get knocked out to have a total of 7 kings, and then there will be an 8th one, which will be the son of perdition. That all has to happen, and that's only the beginning of those signs that's going to happen, and then you're going to have that son of perdition go into the temple of God, the newly rebuilt Solomon's temple, and then shut down the oblations that are taking place, the sacrifices the Jews that are doing. That's all part of the things that are going to have to happen as signs, Jesus said, of what's coming, meaning that his coming, these signs were going to have to happen first. And then you've got the things like the sun, moon, and stars are going to go dark, as the stars are going to fall from heaven, like figs on a fig tree. All that stuff is going to happen. Then you will know the end is right around the corner. Then you will know that Jesus Christ is coming back at any moment once those things happen. But they haven't happened yet. None of that's taken place, but he believes that Jesus came back and they're living in the millennial kingdom. Where exactly was the sign for that? It's absurd. So once those signs come to pass, then God will make a short work of those things, but not until that point. So all the dates from Russell and Barber, they've been exhausted. Everyone was now waiting for this final date that he gave for the end of the world. All the governments are going to be dissolved, 1914. And of course, as you guys can guess, 1914 came and went, and nothing happened. Now, if you've been paying attention to the pattern I've been teaching you guys, remember from what they said, what they've been doing, and I've been showing you guys, what is he going to do next? Now that 1914 failed, what's Charles Russell's next move? Push it back to 1915. And that's exactly what he did. He pushed the date back to 1915. And after 1915 failed, he died in 1916. But the cultists, the Russellite cultists, still cling to their supposedly gospel message, I'll put in quotations. And what is their gospel message? Jesus is coming back at any moment. It's not repentance and faith for the salvation of the souls of the sinners who are lost. It's not about that. It's not about the blood of Jesus Christ cleansing the soul of a man and saving him from the wrath of God and hell and the lake of fire. That's not the gospel message to them. The gospel message to them is Jesus is coming back at any moment, so you better get ready. So they have to find a way to make this true. So now that Charles Russell's dead, Joseph Rutherford then stands up and he's appointed to take Russell's place. So he picked up the torch and he made more predictions to satisfy the lust of the Russellites. So in 1918, Rutherford wrote a book called Millions Now Living Will Never Die. Yes, that is the title to the book, Millions Now Living Will Never Die. And said the end would be in 1925. So this is from his book. It says, quote, "As we have heretofore stated, the great Jubilee cycle is due to begin in 1925. Do you see how they keep giving each one of these predictions a different name? Because really they're all building on each other. For the most part, they keep thinking that all these predictions are actually all true. Because you even remember they said, well, Jesus did come back in 1874. But even 1874 was a prophecy that was based on the 1844 Great Disappointment of William Miller. Because Nelson Barber said, oh, no, he was 30 years off because of this tarrying time. So they're really all believing all of these failed dates. All the ones I've listed out to you, they're believing that all of them are true, but they keep giving a new name to each new one. Okay? So now he's saying the Great Jubilee cycle is due to begin in 1925. What is that even supposed to mean? Well, he says, at that time, the earthly phase of the kingdom shall be recognized. Folks, incognito Jesus is already here. Oh, a lot of Christians have been taken to heaven because of all this harvesting time, okay? And now the kingdom has been set up. Oh, it's been set up. Oh, I know you haven't seen the government's been dissolved, but trust me, they are. And now that kingdom's going to be recognized. This is getting dumber as it goes. I know it really is. And I know a lot of you are thinking that. It's like, this is really stupid. Yes, it is. But I'm telling you, this is the history of Jehovah's Witnesses. This is why we're going over this. He continues to say, therefore we may confidently expect. Did you get that? Confidently. Confident means faith. He says we should confidently expect that 1925 will mark the return of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Yes. He said 1925 will mark the return of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the faithful prophets of old, particularly those named by the apostle in Hebrews 11 to the condition of human perfection, end quote. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all the Old Testament prophets are supposed to return for human perfection? Well, he did teach that, and he went around all over the country and taught this stuff. Now, I've got images on the website. If you're following along on the website, you can check these out. There's all sorts of old news publications that advertise that Joseph Rutherford, because they call him Judge Rutherford because he was a judge, okay? But Joseph Rutherford was coming to town. One here, I'll read you some of them. They said, the world has ended. Millions now living will never die. Free lecture by the Honorable Judge Rutherford, member of New York City Bar. Another one says, a new order of things is here It says millions now living will never die. Free admission, no collections. Well, that was kind of him to do. Judge Joseph F. Rutherford will now lecture in National Theater. This stuff was going on, okay? Here's another one. It says, here, Judge Rutherford. It says, civilization doomed, but millions now living will never die. Okay, because a lot of Jehovah's Witnesses are not even aware this exists. And they think that this stuff, those who are aware of it, they'll say, well, he didn't really mean it like literally like that. Yes, he did. Here, I'll read you another one. This is what this newspaper report said. It says, millions now living will never die. And they have it in quotations, quoting Judge Rutherford. Then he continues and says, in a free lecture in the Auditorium Theater Sunday afternoon, it will be conclusively proven by many Bible prophecies, which have been fulfilled during the past 4 years, and from many others still in the course of fulfillment, that thousands now living in this city will never die. At the bottom, they gave a quote, because it puts on the time, Judge Rutherford, Sunday, February 20th at 3 o'clock in the Auditorium Theater, and at the end it puts a quote directly from Judge Rutherford. It says, I want the statement, millions now living will never die, to be taken literally as it is, in the light of recent fulfilled prophecy, a provable biblical proposition. End quote. That's what it says here. He says, I want you to take this literally as true. Millions now living will never die. And now, folks, I'll ask you, is there anybody that you can think of? I mean, how many people are dead? I mean, or let's do it this way. How many people today are still alive that were even born in 1914? I won't even say just alive during that time, but born in 1914. Because that was 104 years ago. So there's a serious problem here. For example, let's go into this just a little bit more. On page 94 in his book, Millions Now Living Will Never Die, Rutherford states that Jesus Christ died for the sins of all mankind, but then on the next page, I went and I read this myself, on the next page he limits the people who can be saved only to those who hear the message of it in the final days. That means in 1925. He says, quote, it would be impossible for the human race, therefore, to accept the gift of life everlasting before it is offered. Did you get that? He said it would be impossible for the human race, therefore, to accept the gift of life everlasting before it is offered. Well, then how did Abraham get it? How did Seth and his line in Genesis, how did they get it? Well, you see, there's the problem. There's a lot of contradiction going on here. He says, it will be offered only in God's due time, and the divine plan shows that his due time is after the seed of promise is developed, after the kingdom is set up. I'm sorry, what? After the kingdom is set up, he's talking about after 1925. He says, and then each one in his order will be brought to a knowledge of the fact that a plan of redemption exists and that the way is open for him to accept the terms of it and live, end quote. Well, if that's not confusing, what do you mean that the seed of promise is only these people who hear this message in 1925, only they are going to be saved? That's absurd. The Bible doesn't back that up. Let's get back to the false prophecies a little bit more here, okay? A 1922 issue of the Watchtower said that the 1925 prophecy was better than the 1914 prophecy. Well, I thought Charles Russell said this was absolute. This thing was definitely going to happen here. And he says, well, wait, it's 1915, and then he died, and nothing happened. But they said, oh, wait, this one's better. It doesn't even say that 1914 was false. Because if you say it was false, then he's a false prophet, and then nobody should be following the Jehovah's Witnesses. They won't say that, but they said, oh, well, this is a better one. From the Watchtower, in an article they wrote called Europe in a Boiling Cauldron in 1922, they said, quote, "The physical facts show beyond question of a doubt that 1914 ended the Gentile times, and as the Lord foretold, the old order is being destroyed by war, famine, pestilence, and revolution. The date 1925 is even more distinctly indicated by the scriptures because it is fixed by the law God gave to Israel," end quote. So again, who's left alive today who originally read this in 1918? I mean, basically okay, it's not even 1918, because basically what he's saying, the cutoff point would have been 1914, and then you would have, well, the cutoff point, I guess if I want to say it in that way, it would have been 1925. So it was the scale between 1914 and 1925. That's what they're claiming. There are not a whole lot of people left alive today who were alive during that time. Even if they were born during that time, there's not a whole lot of people left alive today. Because even in 1925, it's 18 plus 75, that's 93 years old. At minimum, 93 years old. But they're claiming it was 1914 was the cutoff date in a lot of places on here, so that'd have to be 104 years old. How many 104-year-old people are left alive today? There aren't a whole lot of them, and definitely I would not say millions. I would not go so far to say that the world has millions of 104 plus old people left alive today. And I am being as generous with this as I possibly can. Because you would, again, it's not just the people who are left alive. You have to find Russellites or Jehovah's Witnesses who are left alive. How many Jehovah's Witnesses do you think are alive today who were born before 1925? I mean, either they are dwindling fast or they're already depleted. Which actually means the truth is that millions now living have died. And that clearly shows that Charles Russell, Nelson Barber, William Miller, Joseph Rutherford, they are all false prophets. They are the devil's prophets. And I'm going to go back to the beginning of the chapter in the article and reread this one more time, because this comes from jw.org and Insights on the Scriptures, Volume 2, 1988. It says, quote, "The three essentials for establishing the credentials of a true prophet as given through Moses were, number one, they say the true prophet would speak in Jehovah's name. Number two, the things foretold would come to pass. And number three, the prophesying must promote true worship, being in harmony with God's revealed word and commandments," end quote. By their own definitions, they're proving that they are false prophets. So Rutherford, as we just mentioned a little bit ago, gave another prophecy to his followers that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were coming back to reign on earth. I know, it's absurd, because the Bible never mentions anything like that, even though they just said, well, this is, what did he say specifically? The date 1925 is even more distinctly indicated by the Scriptures. But nowhere is this mentioned. I mean, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all the old prophets, he talked about them being mentioned in Hebrews 11. That's it, they're mentioned there, under a completely different context. All they did was take that verse out of its context and apply it to their false prophecy. That's literally all they do, because people are sitting there thinking, how can you possibly connect that together? They don't have to. All they have to have is a cult following, and all they have to do is say it. That's it. And people seem to believe it. But they took this prophecy that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were coming back to this earth. They took it so seriously that they had a mansion built to house the three of them. I'm not kidding. They was going to house the three of them and some other biblical figures who were some of the Old Testament prophets, like Isaiah, Jeremiah, all those different ones, right? And they were falsely prophesied to return in 1925. The building is called Beth Sarim. It's a mansion. By the way, it still exists to this day. And I've got photographs on the website of Beth Sarim in 1929 and present day. I also have a photograph of Rutherford getting into one of his 2 luxury cars. You see, back in that day, this is the very early 1900s here, most people didn't have a car. And most people didn't have a luxury car. Definitely it was rare for somebody to have 2 luxury cars. That means you had quite a bit of money, and he was flaunting his wealth. So Beth Sarim, what does it mean? It means house of princes, because the word Beth means house, okay? Sarim, princes, that's what that is. House of princes. Although official Jehovah's Witness and Watchtower publications today will claim it was constructed as a winter home for Rutherford due to his health complications. That's what they say today. Now, it is true that Rutherford had health complications. I don't argue that. And it is true that he lived there during the winters. I don't argue that either. But again, they are lying, because they're claiming that it was constructed for that purpose. That is a lie. It was not constructed for that purpose. They're trying to hide the embarrassment of false prophecy by claiming it was built for Rutherford's comfort. Now, on the website, I have a photocopy from Rutherford's magazine called The Golden Age, in which he documented what is written in the deed to the house. I'm going to read it to you right now. It says, quote, "Both the grantor and the grantee, the said Joseph F. Rutherford, are fully persuaded from the Bible testimony, which is the word of Jehovah God, and from extraneous evidence that God's kingdom is now in the course of establishment, and that it will result beneficially for the peoples of earth, that the governing power and authority will be invisible to men," that's incognito Jesus, "but that the kingdom of God will have visible representatives on earth." I repeat, he said the kingdom of God will have visible representatives on earth. Well, who's that? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? That's what they think. The kingdom of God will have visible representatives on earth who will have charge of the affairs of the nations under supervision of the invisible ruler of Christ. Incognito Jesus. Now, first of all, before I even continue with the quotation, do you understand how ridiculous it is that, first of all, he says, well, they're going to have authority over all the nations of the world. So this little mansion of Beth Sarim, this is where they'll house. This is where they're going to stay while they're doing all that. Whose idea was this? Well, I can tell you it was Rutherford's idea, because he wanted a second house. In fact, he wanted a mansion of his own. So they did it through his Watchtower Society. They ordered all this and paid for it through that so that he could use it while still keeping the guise up, this disguise that, oh, okay, it's really for the church. It's really for God and his kingdom. That's why we're doing this. It's lie after lie. You see, and once you understand that, what they're really doing here, you can see how this is no different than any other preacher or New Age church building or mega preacher or any of this stuff that you see out there where they're ripping people off. It's the same thing. This stuff has been going on for a long time. And it was happening even back in the days of the apostles. After the church was started, there's still people that are taking advantage. Back in the days of the Jews in the Old Testament beforehand, there were people that would just take advantage of people being in a religious position, having lots of power and money, who will take advantage of the people. There's never been a time in history where this has not been done. But he continues in here and says that among those who will be thus the faithful representatives and visible governors of the world will be David, who was once king over Israel. So yeah, they said that King David was going to come back. And Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and Joseph. So some of those that are mentioned are the judges of Israel that they're talking about. And Joseph, formerly ruler of Egypt, and Samuel the prophet, and other faithful men named with approval in the Bible at Hebrews, the 11th chapter. There's nothing in the context of Hebrews 11 that indicates that in any way. It continues and says, the condition herein is that the said Watchtower and Bible Tract Society shall hold said title perpetually in trust for the use of any or all of the men above named as representatives of God's kingdom on earth, and that such men shall have possession and use of said property herein above described as they may deem for the best interest for the work in which they are engaged. They're going to hold the title perpetually. That means continually throughout time. Specifically for what? It says, for all of the men above named as representatives of God's kingdom. Don't let a Jehovah's Witness tell you that they did that, it's for Rutherford's health condition. That's not true. I'm showing you right here. By Rutherford's own statement, he's quoting exactly the document. This is what's written on the deed. Or at least was at that time. They may have changed it, I don't know. But it continues to says, any persons appearing to take possession of said premises shall first prove and identify themselves to the proper officers of said society as the person or persons described in Hebrews chapter 11 and in this deed, end quote. So what they would have to do is like, well, if you're Abraham, you need to come and identify yourself as Abraham. I'm wondering if somebody came along and tried to say that at one point. I don't know. I don't know if anybody came to them and claimed that they were Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or somebody like that, right? I think it would be kind of humorous if they did, just to see how they would react. I have no idea. But you'll notice that Rutherford never first proved himself to have the identity of these men. So why was he staying there? You see, because this was on the deed. The only people who were supposed to be taking possession and staying in that house were those men listed there. As far as I understand, Joseph Rutherford's name was not mentioned in Hebrews 11. So he actually broke the contractual agreement on the house. But since it was owned by the Watchtower, he never had to fear a lawsuit because, again, it makes no sense for the company to sue their own CEO. And in Jehovah's Witnesses, the Jehovah's Witness mentality, you don't sue the church, right? In reality, Rutherford was living in the top brackets of luxury from the profits of his books and magazines, and his supposed prophecy was a convenient excuse for him to buy a mansion and live in it. The New York Times published an article talking about Rutherford's 1925 prophecy. Not only was it mentioned in the deed, but here's a news article that talked about it. It says, quote, if Moses was to descend upon earth today, he could very probably solve most of the distressing problems of the day, but I have not the slightest doubt but that Moses would be clapped into jail, just as we were. So it said Alexander Hugh Macmillan, at the closing session of the convention of the International Bible Students Association. Now, what is that? That is the Millerite Russellite organization, okay? Yesterday afternoon in the Academy of Music, Brooklyn, the speaker said he wanted to warn all the sinners to prepare for the millennium, which is to arrive in 1925. Moses and Abraham will be here then, he declared, and we shall be associated with the holy ancients when the kingdom of God is upon earth. These ancients will help to restore man to a proper civilized condition, end quote. That was in the New York Times. All right, Jehovah's Witnesses, if this is not true, then why has the Watchtower not sued the New York Times for libel? They could have. If this was a lie, and it all wasn't true, then why didn't they sue the New York Times for libel? Because there has been newspapers sued before on that basis. Charles Russell did it. I'm not going to talk about that yet, but in later chapters we're going to find out about that. So why didn't the Russellite and Millerite organizations file suit? Doesn't make any sense. for them not to, unless what they were saying here was true. So again, don't let them tell you that that was this convenient excuse for it. No. The original purpose of that building was to house the people of their false prophecy. So Macmillan, who was speaking at the convention, mentioned in the news article that I just quoted to you, he didn't understand that Rutherford and Russell had claimed that the millennial reign of Christ was already in progress. That was one of the things he didn't understand. But many Millerites and Russellites were deceived about what their religion taught. Because again, you have people saying things back and forth so many times. It's not like, today the internet where you have a single website everybody can go to and get the same thing. So you've got a whole bunch of people teaching a bunch of different things because they're taught to teach all these false prophecies and false doctrines. And so not everybody is on the same page. But nonetheless, 1925 came and went, and nothing happened. Despite the fact that the Watchtower claimed that the date of 1925 was, quote, definitely settled by the Scriptures, end quote. That's what they said. And that the people had more reason to believe in the prophecy of 1925 than Noah had to believe in the coming flood. That's what they said. Here, this is from the Watchtower publication, April 1st, 1923. Quote, question, did the order go from forth 8 months ago to the pilgrims, so they're talking about to the Russellite believers at that time, to cease talking about 1925? So they're asking, wait a second, we're being ordered to stop talking about 1925. So they're asking this. Have we more reason, or as much, to believe the kingdom will be established in 1925 than Noah had to believe that there would be a flood? Answer. It is surprising how reports get abroad. There was never at any time any intimation to the pilgrim brethren that they should cease talking about 1925. Anyone who has made the statement that such an instruction was sent out has made it without any authority or excuse or cause. The thought that 1925 is definitely settled by the Scriptures, marking the end of the typical jubilees. Just exactly what will happen at that time no one can tell to a certainty, but we expect such a climax in the affairs of the world that the people will begin to realize the presence of the Lord and His kingdom power. I didn't say that. This is what the Watchtower stated. He is already present, as we know, and has taken unto himself his power and begun his reign. He has come to his temple. He is dashing to pieces the nations. Exactly where did this happen? They continue to say, every Christian ought to be content then to do with his might what his hands find to do, without stopping to quibble about what is going to happen on a certain date. As to Noah, the Christian now has much more upon which to base his faith than Noah had, so far as the Scriptures reveal, upon which to base his faith in a coming deluge. End quote. So it appears that somebody in the organization told people to stop preaching about 1925. Whether by accident or someone within was convicted to come out and speak the truth, I don't know what it was, but there were people with doubts. To reestablish their faith in the 1925 prediction, the Watchtower directly told them that it was definitely settled in Scripture that incognito Jesus was in his temple, wherever that was supposed to be. I have no idea. They don't say either. Even though they had no way to know that, there was no way to verify it, and that incognito Jesus was, quote, dashing to pieces the nations, end quote, even though it's unclear what they mean by that. The whole answer was a little odd, a lot odd, but the fact is that they declared in no uncertain terms that all people should have the faith that incognito Jesus was to reveal himself to the world and take over the nations in 1925. They stated that clearly, and that this should be believed more so than the prophecy of the flood in the days of Noah. They stated that very clearly too. Of course, what happened in 1925? Nothing. So we got to come up with some excuses, right? That's you start to think like a Jehovah's Witness. This is what you got to do. So they're going to push it back a little further to hang on to their cult members, right? So Rutherford decided to hold a Q&A because obviously there's a lot of questions, which, by the way, quote, took place May 1st through 3rd, 1926, end quote, where he was questioned on this matter and lied. In this yearbook article from 1980, which is also in the Watchtower, July 1st, 1926, it says, quote, question, have the ancient worthies returned? Now, who are the ancient worthies? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all the other people. Samson, Joseph, all these other guys, right? That's what they're asking. Answer from Rutherford. Certainly, they have not returned. No one has seen them, and it would be foolish to make such an announcement. It was stated in the Millions book that we might reasonably expect them to return shortly after 1925. Did you get that? He said that we might reasonably expect them to return shortly after 1925, but this was merely an expressed opinion. Besides, it is still shortly after 1925, end quote. Now, when we've just read Rutherford's Millions Now Living Will Never Die, he did not say we might reasonably expect, because he very shamefully tries to convince his listening audience of that. We read earlier, he said, quote, we may confidently expect 1925 will mark the return of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the faithful prophets of old to the condition of human perfection, end quote. Also, he did not say it was, quote, merely an expressed opinion, end quote. The Watchtower said it was more certain than the flood in the days of Noah. That's what we just read from them. But since most of the Russellites in that day probably never read the entirety of Rutherford's book, they couldn't see the facade. Just as most Jehovah's Witnesses today have never read it either, and they can't see the facade. They can't see the false prophets of these. Because again, the Watchtower does not permit them to read any materials outside of the Watchtower Society, and the Watchtower Society censors all this stuff. In 1993, this is 1993 now, the Watchtower answered the growing concerns of Jehovah's Witnesses as this information was actually starting to become more readily available. People were starting to get a hold of this stuff, okay? From the Watchtower publication, November 1st, 1993, they said, quote, ever since the 1870s, Bible students have been serving with a date in mind, first 1914, then 1925. Now they realized that they must serve for as long as Jehovah wishes, end quote. What a convenient excuse. Never once do they address the fact that the prophets, or these so-called prophets, who started their religion were false. They never address that, which would make their religion a lie that is not of God. That means they're of the devil. They will never confess this because the members would leave the Jehovah's Witness cult in droves. And that statement helps to drill into their minds, the cultist minds, right? That they need to stop, like, just keep on working. Keep on working. Don't think about it. Stop thinking about the stuff. Just keep on working. And they do keep them busy enough to where they don't have time to think about these things. However, getting back to the early 1900s, soon after 1926, many people finally got tired of waiting and they came to their senses. And according to a 1959 Watchtower publication, those actively participating in what they call the memorials, that's what we would call communion, right? The amount of people actively participating in that increased from 32,661 in 1922. Okay, so this is 1922. They had recorded 32,661. Then they got all these false prophecies coming in, and by 1925 they had 90,434. But after the prophecies failed, From 1925 to 1926, people started coming to their senses, and by 1928, their numbers had dropped over 80%. It went down to 17,360, which was about half of what they originally had in 1922. So for the remnant left over after the false prophecies, all this fiasco of 1925, Rutherford named his cult the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, we talked about that earlier. This is where he finally filed the corporate name for this, because he wanted to separate himself from the many various sects that developed out of the Millerites and Russellites, because even the people that left the Jehovah's Witnesses would go somewhere else, or they would branch off and have other people said, well, they're wrong, and I'm going to show you the right path, and they keep branching out more cults. Okay? And like I said, in the later part of this teaching, we're going to go over some of that and show you the chain of how they got developed. So after the massive drop in memberships and attendance from the last failed prophecy, the newly incorporated Jehovah's Witnesses, all their board members, learned some valuable lessons. Namely, or more specifically, that they should not be so specific with the dates, and present a more generalized or vague idea and then let people draw their own conclusions from it. Now, I've watched many audio and video recordings of people talking with Jehovah's Witnesses about this subject. And these various people attempt to explain to Jehovah's Witnesses that the organization has a long history of false prophets, many, many false prophecies. Most Jehovah's Witnesses are trained to keep in their mind that most people do not have documentation on hand for these false prophecies. They won't have this information memorized. So what happens is when they bring it up, and this is what you'll typically get from a Jehovah's Witness, they'll say, well, who exactly wrote it, and what did it say word for word? Where exactly was this written? Where did you get this information from? And they know the people they're talking to on the fly will not have all the information memorized. Instead of them saying, oh, I didn't realize that. Let me take the time to go look this up and see and check out the information. Now, even if they do say that, you might run into some Jehovah's Witnesses who do say that, but they won't go do it. Why? Well, one of two reasons. Number one, they don't care. Or number two, they will only look at jw.org for that information and they won't find all of it because it's censored. So they'll just say, oh, well, that guy he's just a non-believer that doesn't know what he's talking about. He was trying to lie and deceive me. Because again, they can't look at anything that's not Watchtower approved. Now, I've heard these challenges that have been made by Jehovah's Witnesses a few times about the 1975 prophecy. Oh yeah, there's a 1975 one too. This is the more recent one that they've had. I don't think the Jehovah's Witnesses have had any of them since this, because they realized, wait a second, we're getting a little too deep in the mud here. Maybe we should back off on this. But they did, at one time, prophesy that 1975 would be the end of the world. Now, in conversation, Jehovah's Witnesses claim, now because this one's more recent, a lot more people have knowledge of this, they claim that since we can't see what was actually said, so we're not going to make any assumptions about this. Which technically, I mean, if you're in a conversation with them and you can't see what was said, that is fair. So for the sake of clarity, I'm going to give you exactly what was said here. Now, first of all, I'm going to start off with a Watchtower publication from 1968, which is entitled, Why Are You Looking Forward to 1975? Now in this, I'm just going to quote the first part of this because I want to show you how vague they've started to get now. They really don't, because the plan is to increase the numbers by the excitement of this coming fulfillment of prophecy in the end of the world, but then when it doesn't come to pass, not lose so many members. To sit back and say, guys, we didn't actually say that, but the vagueness only went so far, and I'll show you what I mean. Let's begin on this. From 1968, it says, quote, "What about all this talk concerning the year 1975? Lively discussions, some based on speculation, have burst into flame during recent months among serious students of the Bible. Their interest has been kindled by the belief that 1975 will mark the end of 6,000 years of human history since Adam's creation. The nearness of such an important date indeed fires the imagination and presents unlimited possibilities for discussion." End quote. So as you can see, that was pretty vague. What exactly is supposed to happen at the end of the 6,000 years of human history? Well, they never said specifically, but kind of like how politicians do, they imply what would happen without actually saying it. So that way when it doesn't come to pass, they can just justify themselves saying, "Oh, we never said that." But as we're going to see, the mark of that end of 6,000 years, what they claim is at the end of that, the next 1,000 years is supposed to be the 1,000-year reign of Christ. So they say the 1,000-year reign of Christ was supposed to start in 1975, even though it was supposed to start like 50 years earlier. I mean, the false prophets are contradicting each other now. We're getting pretty deep in the mud at this point. Jehovah's Witnesses, nonetheless, they do heavily imply what they mean by the prophecy of 1975. And this is stated in audio clips. I'm going to play you, I have 2 audio clips that I found of some of the preaching on these. Now I'm going to play them for you just so you can hear them, and I think this is more for the sake of Jehovah's Witnesses than anything. They might be a little difficult to understand, but I want to play them for the sake of Jehovah's Witnesses, that they can see that these things were actually said. One by the name of Sonetko was his name, Overseer Sonetko, and the other was Overseer Duggan. That was his name, who are preaching these things. So let's take a listen.
Well, now, as Jehovah's Witnesses, as runners, even though some of us have become a little weary, it almost seems as though Jehovah has provided meat in due season, because he's held up before all of us a new goal, a new year, something to reach out for, and it just seems it's given all of us so much more energy and power in this final burst of speed to the finish line. And that's the year 1975. As one brother put it, stay alive to 75.
So Jehovah's word is in your mouth. This good news must be preached first, before Armageddon. There will be now a remaining few months, not really a full 83 months remains. So let's be faithful and confident, and we'll be alive beyond the war of Babylon. We will be alive beyond the war of Armageddon. Yes, brothers and sisters, by doing this, having plenty to do, we will be alive in God's new system of things, to live and to share in the work for 1,000 years, and there will be plenty to do for the next 1,000 years.
All right, so there's applause at the end of that. So, okay, what was said in general, in case you didn't understand everything that was said, because like I said, this is back in the 1960s, so the audio is a little rough. But they said, this final burst of speed to the finish line. That's what Sonetko said. Well, in the Bible, what's the finish line? That's where Christ comes back. He said, and that's the year 1975. He says, as one brother put it, stay alive to 75. That was the motto that they had back then, the Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, Duggan gave more details. He says not really a full 83 months remain. Now, 83 months he was talking about because he was giving that speech in 1968. So that was going to lead up to 1975. And he says, we will be alive beyond the war of Armageddon. What's the war of Armageddon? That's the end. He said, we will be alive in God's new system of things to live and share in the work for 1,000 years. That's the 1,000-year reign of Christ. They said that was supposed to come about in 1975. And that was spoken confidently, stated clearly by these Jehovah's Witness preachers. Now, the Watchtower published a few more details in their May 1st publication in 1968. They said, quote, the seventh day of the Jewish week, the Sabbath, would well picture the final 1,000-year reign of God's kingdom under Christ, when mankind would be uplifted from the 6,000 years of sin and death. Hence, when Christians note from God's timetable the approaching end of 6,000 years of human history, by the way, they mean 1975, that's the approaching end of 6,000 years of human history, it fills them with anticipation. The immediate future is certain to be filled with climactic events, for this old system is nearing its complete end. Within a few years, at most, the final parts of Bible prophecy relative to the last days will undergo fulfillment, resulting in the liberation of surviving mankind into Christ's glorious 1,000-year reign, end quote. Now, was that vague, or was it a misunderstanding or something? No, that was stated clearly. The end is in 1975, and again, nothing happened. That was supposed to be the beginning of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. The last days and the events of the book of Revelation would, they said, undergo fulfillment. I mean, all the faithful Jehovah's Witnesses were supposed to join Christ in this reign, according to them. Now, it also creates some confusion because I would like to point out that in order for Christ to reign, he would have to be recreated by God. Because they believed that Michael the Archangel ceased to exist, Christ was created, then Christ died, he stayed dead, Michael the Archangel was recreated, and that means that Jesus would have to be recreated again, which means Michael the Archangel would not have to exist anymore, and then it had to recreate Jesus for him to reign on earth. Which means Michael the Archangel currently, if their prophecies are true, doesn't exist because incognito Jesus is invisible on earth. I'm just going by what they teach, okay? In 1968, the Watchtower clearly stated that these events from the book of Revelation would be fulfilled within a few years at most. We're 5 decades, when I'm giving this teaching, we are 5 decades past that point. Or at least getting close to 5 decades. We're 4 to 5 decades, whatever. The point is, they were preaching this in 1968. So yes, we are 5 decades past. So, as I said earlier, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they made more effort to be vague in their writings on this false prophecy, learning from their past mistakes. But despite their best efforts, they still answered with enough specific detail because their followers were demanding it to give us a clear definition of what they mean by what they say. So Jehovah's Witnesses stated there was only a margin of error for weeks or months for this prophecy, not years. And I'll show you from that same article I started reading earlier, why are you looking forward to 1975? From the Watchtower in 1968, they said, quote, "Are we to assume from this study that the Battle of Armageddon will be over by the autumn of 1975 and the long-looked-for 1,000-year reign of Christ will begin by then? Possibly. But we will wait to see how closely the 7,000-year period of man's existence coincides with the Sabbath-like 1,000-year reign of Christ." Okay, so far what they're saying, well, it's possible, but we don't know. Well, just wait till you hear all this. I'll show you what they mean by possibly here. They said if these two periods run parallel with each other as to the calendar year, it will not be by mere chance or accident, but will be according to Jehovah's loving and timely purposes. Our chronology, however, which is reasonably accurate but admittedly not infallible, they say it's reasonably accurate but not infallible, we might have made some mistakes here, at the best only points to the autumn of 1975 as the end of 6,000 years of mankind's existence on earth. It does not necessarily mean that 1975 marks the end of the first 6,000 years of Jehovah's seventh-day creative day. Why not? Because after his creation, Adam lived for some time during the sixth day, which unknown amount of time would need to be subtracted from Adam's 930 years to determine when the 7,000-year period or day ended. How long Adam lived into the seventh day, and yet the end of that sixth creative day could end within the same Gregorian calendar year of Adam's creation. So basically what they're trying to say is that Adam lived a certain amount of time, perhaps in the Garden of Eden or something like that, and there's an extended amount of time you have to add onto that. So they're saying, okay, well, however long that was, we don't know the exact number. However, they end by saying, it may involve only a difference of weeks or months, not years, end quote. So what they're saying is that if it's not 1975 and 1975 passes, well, it could be a differentiation of the Gregorian calendar to the Hebrew calendar. It could be a differentiation of a little bit more time for Adam that he lived past a certain point. Okay? But they said it's only weeks or months. It's not going to be years. They said it is definitely 1975 when all this comes to a close. So you see how, like, through all this, when I was reading it, they were saying phrases like, well, it's reasonably accurate, or it may come to pass, or if this happens, or possibly this might occur. This is their effort to create some sort of insurance policy to protect themselves if it doesn't work out. They're trying to keep as much of the growth in membership as possible after the prophecy fails, because they know it's going to. So following in Rutherford's footsteps, the Watchtower published the statements in 1969 that the living Jehovah's Witnesses would never grow old. In his Awake magazine, May 22nd, 1969, because Awake is another Watchtower publication, it says, quote, "If you are a young person, you also need to face the fact that you will never grow old in this present system of things. Why not? Because all the evidence in fulfillment of Bible prophecy indicates that this corrupt system is due to end in a few years." Remember, that's in 1969. "Of the generation that observed the beginning of the last days in 1914, Jesus foretold, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things occur." Now, they actually have that part right. Once the signs of the end, which I mentioned earlier in this teaching, start to happen, that generation won't pass away until all the events are fulfilled. However, they believe that the appearance of incognito Jesus in the prophecy of 1914 was the signs of those times. And they said this generation will not pass away until all those things occur. Again, 1914 was 104 years ago. That generation has long passed away. It says, "Therefore, as a young person, you will never fulfill any career that this system offers. If you are in high school and thinking about a college education, it means at least 4, perhaps even 6 or 8 more years to graduate into a specialized career. But where will this system of things be by that time? It will be well on the way toward its finish, if not actually gone." End quote. Folks, there is no room for error or confusion here. They stated clearly and even encouraged young people not to go to college, not to start any career, not to start a family, not to do any of that stuff. Because, after all this stuff was going to come to pass, and the present system of things, which the world the way it's working right now, was going to end in 1975. But here we are 50 years later, and nothing's happened. So we're not done. That's a good place for us to stop right now. We're not done on this part, because I'm going to give you some more information on this and show you some more contradictions that they're making on these things. And then once we're done with that, next week we're also going to begin to talk about the New World Translation. What is the specific Jehovah's Witness Bible that they created? How is that formed? What kind of contradictions are in that? And show you that their so-called perfect book, which they think is a perfect book, has numerous errors and contradictions in it, and what the real purpose, why did they create this? We'll reveal that more next week. So did anybody have any questions or comments about anything we talked about today before we close? Well, thanks for joining us, everybody, this week, and may the Lord Jesus Christ bless and protect you all as you seek to study His Word and glorify Him in all that you say and do. And God willing, we will see you next week.